Imagine you are standing in the doorway of an enormous old house at night. The hallway stretches out in front of you, longer than the beam of any flashlight can reach. And along that hallway are doors. You start counting them. 10, 20, 40, 60. You stop at 66. In your hand is a single key. And somehow, you know that key opens every one of them. That house is the Bible. 66 separate books. More than 40 different authors, kings and shepherds, fishermen and physicians, a tax collector, a prisoner, a runaway. Written across roughly 1,500 years. On 3 continents. In 3 languages. By people who never met each other, most of whom had no idea the others existed. And here is the claim that should stop you cold. The claim is that all 66 of these books, written by all these strangers across all these centuries, tell one single story. Not 66 stories. One, with a beginning, a turning point, and an ending that reaches back and grabs the beginning by the hand. Most people never see it. They walk into 2 or 3 rooms of this house their whole lives. The Christmas story, maybe a psalm at a funeral, John chapter 3, verse 16, and they leave the other 63 doors shut. Locked. A little intimidating. Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Leviticus. Who even opens those? You're about to. All of them. In order. Here's what most people miss. The order is not random. These books were not thrown into a pile and stapled together. They were arranged, like rooms in a house are arranged, so that you move through them and something builds. So today we're going to walk down the hallway together, and I'm going to hand you the master key, 1 room at a time. 1 turn per door. By the end, you'll know what every book of the Bible is really about, not the Sunday school version, the real version, and you'll see the thread that ties the whole thing together. But before we take a single step, I need you to hold on to something, because it shows up in the very first room, and then it vanishes. In the opening pages, there is a garden, and in the middle of the garden, there is a tree. It's called the tree of life. And when everything goes wrong, and it goes wrong fast, the very first humans are driven out, away from that tree, and a flaming sword is set to guard the way back. But on their way out the door, God says something strange into the middle of the disaster. A promise that one day, a child would be born who would crush the thing that ruined everything. Hold on to that tree. Hold on to that promise. Because we will not see that tree again for 64 books. This is not a list. This is not a summary. This is not a reading assignment you can feel guilty about. This is a walk through one house, 66 rooms, and every single one of them, it turns out, was built around the same thing. Let's open the first door. The first 5 rooms belong to one man. His name is Moses, an Egyptian-raised Hebrew, who couldn't speak in public without stumbling over his own tongue, and who God used anyway. These 5 books are called the Law, but that word can throw you off. In Hebrew, the word is Torah, and it doesn't mean rulebook. It means teaching, instruction, the way home. Keep that in mind, because these first 5 rooms are not about regulations. They're about a God who keeps introducing himself to people who keep forgetting him. Genesis is the room where everything starts. Creation, a garden, a tree, a choice that breaks the world, a flood that nearly ends it, and then a single old man named Abraham, who is promised that through his family, every family on earth will one day be blessed. That promise is the seed of the entire rest of the Bible. Watch it grow. Exodus is the rescue. Abraham's descendants are now slaves in Egypt, and God brings them out through plagues and a parted sea, and gives them, at a mountain, a way to live as a free people. This is where the story stops being about one family and starts being about a nation. Leviticus, the room everyone dreads, is the manual for how a broken people can live near a holy God without being destroyed by the sheer weight of that holiness. Blood, sacrifice, a cost for everything. Remember the cost. It matters later. Numbers is the wandering, 40 years in a desert, because a generation was too afraid to trust. And Deuteronomy is Moses, old now, standing at the edge of the promised land he will never enter, giving one last, aching speech, telling the people everything, one more time, before he climbs a mountain to die, within sight of the home he'll never touch. That's the law. 5 rooms. Beginning, rescue, cost, wandering, farewell. Now the hallway opens into a long stretch of 12 rooms, the history books, and here the whole nation rises and falls like a chest breathing. Joshua takes them into the land. Judges is the terrifying cycle that follows. The people forget God. Disaster comes. They cry out. God rescues them. They forget again. Over and over. It reads like a nation with amnesia. Ruth is a quiet breath in the middle of it. A foreign widow whose loyalty puts her, of all people, into the family line of a future king. Then come the kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel give you David, a shepherd boy who kills a giant, then becomes a warrior, then a king, then an adulterer, then a broken man weeping over his own sins. Not a cartoon hero, a real one. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles track what happens after him, a kingdom that splits in two, then slowly rots from the inside until foreign empires march in and drag the people into exile. Ezra and Nehemiah are the return, a battered remnant coming home to rebuild a ruined city and a broken wall. And Esther is the one book where God's name is never even mentioned, and yet you feel his fingerprints on every page, as a young Jewish woman risks her life to stop the extermination of her entire people. That's the history. The nation is born. It soars, it splits, it falls, it comes home limping. And through all of it, that ancient promise to Abraham refuses to die. Now the hall opens into something completely different. 5 rooms where nobody's marching anywhere. This is the poetry and the wisdom, and it's here that the Bible stops narrating and starts feeling. Job is the oldest question humans ask, dragged into the light. Why do good people suffer? A righteous man loses everything, his children, his health, his wealth, and spends the whole book demanding an answer from a silent sky. And when God finally speaks, he doesn't give an argument. He gives a person, himself. Psalms sits at the physical center of your Bible, and that's fitting because it's the heart. 150 songs. David wrote many of them. And here is what's remarkable about this room. There is no emotion you have ever felt that isn't already in here. Rage, despair, joy so big it can't hold still, guilt, wonder. When you don't have words for what you feel, this room already wrote them down 3,000 years ago. Proverbs is the wisdom of daily life. How to speak, how to work, how to handle money, and anger in your own mouth. Ecclesiastes is a king at the end of his life staring at everything he built and whispering, it's all meaningless, unless there's something bigger than this. And Song of Songs is, of all things, an unashamed love poem, a reminder that the God who made the stars also made the ache between two people who belong to each other. Stay with me, because look at what's happened in just 17 rooms. A world was made and broken. A promise was made to one man. A nation was rescued, given a way to live, marched into a land, watched itself fall apart, and dragged into exile and back. And then, in the poetry, that same nation sat down in the wreckage and sang about grief, about hope, about a longing for something, someone who hadn't come yet. Every room so far has been leaning forward, reaching for something off the page, and they don't even fully know what they're reaching for. But there's a group of men in the next rooms who are about to say it out loud. Let me stop us in the middle of the hallway for just a second, because you've earned it. We're halfway through the house, 17 rooms behind us, and every single one has been pointing forward, reaching for something that hasn't arrived yet. If this walk is doing for you what it did for me the first time, if doors that were locked your whole life are starting to open, do me one favor. Hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel put a key like this into more people's hands. And while you're down there, tell me in the comments, which room have we walked into so far that surprised you the most? I read them. Now, the prophets. The next 5 rooms are big, loud. They belong to the major prophets, and they're called major, not because they matter more, but simply because the books are longer. Isaiah is the first, and it's the one I need you to slow down for. Isaiah is preaching in Jerusalem around 700 years before Jesus is born. 7 centuries. And in the 53rd chapter of his book, he writes something that should make the hair on your arms stand up. He describes a man, a servant, who is despised, rejected, pierced, crushed. He was wounded for our transgressions, Isaiah writes. By his stripes we are healed. A man who suffers silently, and by his suffering somehow heals everyone else. 700 years before it happens, someone is describing the cross. Hold that. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet, the man who watched Jerusalem burn and warned them it was coming, and no one listened. Lamentations is his funeral song for a dead city, 5 poems of pure grief. Ezekiel is the prophet of wild visions, wheels in the sky, a valley of dry bones that rattle and rise and come back to life. And Daniel is the young exile in a foreign court who won't bow, who reads the writing on the wall and survives a den of lions, and who sees, in a vision, kingdoms rising and falling all the way to the end of time. Then the hallway narrows into 12 small rooms in a row, the minor prophets. Short books, 12 of them. And here's the part nobody tells you. They are not minor at all. They are the sound of God's heart breaking. Because underneath every one of these 12 books is the same ache. God's people keep leaving him, chasing other gods, crushing the poor, going through religious motions with cold hearts, and God keeps calling them back. Hosea is told to marry a woman who will be unfaithful to him over and over, so that Hosea can feel in his own chest exactly what God feels when his people cheat on him. That's the whole book, a living picture of a love that will not quit. Joel and Amos and Obadiah thunder about justice, that you cannot trample the poor and sing worship songs on the same Sabbath and expect God not to notice. Jonah is the runaway, the prophet, who is so angry that God might forgive his enemies, that he gets on a boat going the opposite direction, gets swallowed by a great fish, and still doesn't get it. It's the funniest and most uncomfortable book in the Old Testament, because Jonah is us. Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, warnings, comfort, calls to rebuild. And then comes the last one, Malachi, the final room in the entire Old Testament. And Malachi ends with a promise that a messenger is coming, that the Son of Righteousness will rise, with healing in its wings. And then the voice stops. For 400 years, there is nothing, no prophet, no new book, no word from God. Between the last page of the Old Testament and the first page of the New, for centuries pass in total silence. Empires rise. The Greeks come. The Romans come. Generations are born, live, and die, waiting for a promise that everyone is starting to wonder if God has forgotten. Think about that. 400 years of a locked door. Look at what these 17 prophetic voices did across those pages. They warned. They wept. They dreamed impossible dreams of bones coming back to life and a suffering servant healing the world. And every one of them was pointing at something, someone, coming just over the horizon. A messenger, a servant, a king, a child. And then, for 4 centuries, nothing but the sound of a world holding its breath. Until, in a nothing town, in an occupied country, on an ordinary night, the silence breaks. The silence breaks with a baby's cry. We've reached the New Testament, and the first 4 rooms are the ones you already half know. They're called the Gospels, and that word is worth a second, because in Greek it's euangelion, good news. But not gentle, greeting card good news. It's the word a runner shouted when he came sprinting back from a battlefield to announce that the war had been won. That's the register. That's the volume. The war is over. That kind of news. There are 4 Gospels, and people ask why we need 4 when they cover the same life. But think about it like this. If the most important person who ever lived walked through your town, you wouldn't want 1 photograph. You'd want 4 cameras, for angles, for people who saw him and couldn't stop talking about him. Matthew writes for the Jewish reader, and he can barely get through a paragraph without pointing back down the hallway. This fulfills Isaiah. This fulfills what Malachi said. This is the servant. This is the child. He is holding up the Old Testament in one hand and Jesus in the other, and saying, look, look, it's the same person. Mark is the fast one, breathless, urgent, everything happening immediately. The shortest gospel, written like a man who has run to your door and can't wait to get the words out. Luke, and this matters, is written by the only Gentile author in your entire Bible, a Greek physician, a doctor, a careful, precise outsider who tells you plainly, at the very start of his book, that he interviewed the eyewitnesses and wrote it all down in order so that one man named Theophilus and everyone after him would know these things really happened. Luke is the one who gives you the shepherds, the Good Samaritan, the lost son running home to a father who sprints down the road to meet him. And John stands back and tells you what all of it means. In the beginning was the Word, reaching his hand all the way back to the first line of Genesis and closing his fingers around it. John doesn't just report what Jesus did. He tells you who Jesus was before the world began. For cameras, one face. And the story they tell is the hinge the entire house turns on. A carpenter from Nazareth who heals the sick, forgives sinners, touches the untouchable, infuriates the powerful, and claims to be God in a body. Who is arrested in a garden at night, abandoned by his friends, beaten, and nailed to a Roman cross. And there, in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah come to life, he is pierced for our transgressions, exactly as it was written 700 years before. And with his last breath, John records that Jesus says one word. In Greek it's tetelestai. Your translation says, it is finished. But that's not a whimper of defeat. Archaeologists have found that word stamped across ancient bills and business receipts. It meant paid in full. The debt is settled. There is nothing left owing. Remember Leviticus? All that blood, all that cost, room after room, sacrifice after sacrifice, none of it ever quite enough. Tetelestai, paid, in full. The bill that ran through the entire Old Testament, stamped closed on a Friday afternoon. And then, on Sunday, the tomb is empty. And that changes everything, because a dead teacher leaves you a philosophy, but a risen one leaves you with a choice. Acts is the next room, and it's really Luke's second book. The doctor picks his pen right back up. This is where the movement explodes. A dozen terrified fishermen who ran and hid when Jesus was arrested are suddenly on fire, preaching in the open, unable to be silenced by prison or beatings or death. Something happened to those men that fear could no longer touch. And halfway through, a man named Saul, a violent, brilliant persecutor who was hunting Christians down, holding the coats of the men who stoned them, is knocked flat on a road in a blaze of light and stands back up as Paul, who will carry this news across the Roman Empire and write more of your New Testament than any other single person. Which brings us to the longest row of rooms in the house, 21 of them. The letters. Most of them are Paul's, written not from a seminary, but from the road, from rented houses, from prison cells, with the chains still on his wrists. Romans is his masterpiece, and he didn't even write it. With his own hand, he paced and spoke it aloud, while a man named Tertius sat and wrote it down, word by word. And he sent it to a church in a city he had never once set foot in, as a kind of letter of introduction, before he ever arrived. It's the clearest explanation ever written of how a guilty person can be made right, with a holy God, not by being good enough, but by simple trust. 1 Corinthians is where he writes the words read at nearly every wedding you've ever been to. Love is patient, love is kind. Except he wrote them to a church that was tearing itself apart. Philippians he wrote from a jail cell, and it will not stop talking about joy. And the rest, from the writer of Hebrews explaining how Jesus is the final and better sacrifice, to James insisting that real faith shows up in how you actually live, to John's short letters that come back again and again to one word, love. These are letters to real churches with real problems, people fighting, people doubting, people getting it wrong, which is exactly why they still land, because those are your problems too. And then we reach the last door at the end of the hall. Revelation. It was written by an old man named John. The same John, tradition says, from the Gospel, now exiled to a hard little volcanic island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos, for the crime of refusing to shut up about Jesus. And on that rock, at the end of his life, he is given a vision of the end of everything. Now, I told you to hold onto something 64 books ago, a tree, and a promise. Watch what happens in the final chapter of the final book. John sees a new heaven and a new earth. He sees a city coming down out of the sky, and running through the middle of that city, he sees a river, clear as crystal, and on the banks of that river, there it is. The tree of life, the very tree humanity was driven away from on page 3 of Genesis. Except now there's no flaming sword, no guard, no locked door, and John writes that its leaves are for the healing of the nations. Do you feel that? The door that slammed shut in the 3rd chapter of the very first book swings open in the final chapter of the very last one. The promise God whispered on humanity's way out, that one day a child would come and crush what ruined everything, is kept. And the voice from the throne says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The first word of the story, and the last, the same person. This is not 66 books. This is not 40 authors doing 40 separate things. This is not a library that happened to get bound together by accident. This is one story, one rescue, told from 100 angles by people who mostly never knew they were all writing the same sentence. And here's something worth knowing. That order you just walked through wasn't invented by one committee in a back room. The church historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, describes how these books were recognized over generations, tested, read aloud, weighed by communities who had staked their lives on them. A list called the Muratorian Fragment, from around 170 years after Jesus, already names most of these same books. The rooms were arranged, with care, by people who noticed the thread long before you did. Let me put it the simplest way I can. Most of us treat the Bible like this enormous house we live next to our whole lives, and only ever enter through 2 or 3 familiar doors. The kitchen, the front room. We know the Christmas story and a couple of psalms, and the other 60-something doors stay shut because we assume there's nothing back there for us. But you just walked the whole house, end to end, every room, and you saw the thing you can only see once you've walked all of it, that every hallway slopes toward the same center. Every room was built around one person. The whole architecture was pointing at a face. That's the part that changes how you read all of it. So let me hand you 3 things to carry out the door with you. The first is this. The order is not an accident. 66 books arranged into rooms. The law, the history, the poetry, the prophets, the gospels, the letters, and the vision at the end. Beginning, breaking, waiting, arriving, spreading, and coming home. That's not a random pile someone stapled together. That's architecture. Somebody built this house on purpose, and now you can find your way around it in the dark. The second is for you personally. You do not have to read all 66 books cover to cover before the Bible makes sense to you. That's the wall most people never get over. They open to page 1, hit the long genealogies somewhere around Numbers, and quietly give up, feeling like they failed. But you don't start by reading every room. You start by knowing the map. And you have it now. You know what's behind every door. So when you walk into Habakkuk or Philemon or Nahum, you won't be lost anymore. You'll know which room you're standing in and how it connects to all the others. And the third, this is the one I want to stay with you. Every room in this house was built around the same person. The child promised in the garden. The servant Isaiah saw 700 years early. The word that was there in the beginning. The one who said paid in full and meant it. The Alpha and the Omega. Jesus himself once said that if you read Moses and the prophets rightly, you'll find they were all speaking about him the whole time. The entire library, every genealogy, every psalm, every warning, every letter, was pointing at one face. And when you finally see that, you can't unsee it. You will never read any single room the same way again, because now you know what the whole house was for. So here's my question for you, and I really do want your answer. Of all 66 rooms we just walked through, which one are you finally ready to open? The book you've avoided for years, or the book that just started calling your name? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading. You started tonight in a doorway, holding one key, staring down a hall of 66 locked doors you thought you'd never open. Look at you now. You've walked the whole house, and every door is open.